It's one thing to read the Bible, and I do recommend people read it, but it's another thing whatsoever to analyze it. If you analyze it, you can find some really fascinating things. And that's one of the things I'd like to talk about today. It's something that's not readily apparent, and it's strung out over so much of the Old Testament that if you're just reading, casual reading, you'll miss it. But it is something you find when you analyze it, and I believe it's fascinating. It has to do with life expectancy. You know, we talked about that some last week. As we saw last week, the average life expectancy in the United States is about 77. That has increased since 1960. In 1960, it was about 70. So over the past 64 years, it's increased 7 years. If you look at that in a graph, you'll notice that there was a gradual increase from like 1960 to about 2010. And in 2010, it leveled off. And that's where it is today. And over the past 10 years, it sort of stayed the same. Now, sometimes we believe that life expectancy has increased dramatically due to modern medicine. That is not true. It's sometimes believed that people in the ancient world died when they were 30 or 40 years old. That's not true. Archaeologists tell us that people in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt lived on up into their 70s and 80s. Artwork, statues, figurines have survived that show older people bearing the effects of aging. And analysis has been done on bones and all that you could tell when somebody died. And so people lived on up to their 70s and 80s back then. And anthropologists and archaeologists have done studies that show that among indigenous people with primitive existences in jungles and other remote areas, the most likely age of death, if they survive childhood, is somewhere around 70. And so the low average life expectancy in the ancient world was due mainly to childhood mortality and the violence that characterized the ancient world. If you lived through childhood and you didn't get killed in a war, you could well live into your 70s or 80s. And the Bible itself seems to reflect that. Psalm 90 says this, "The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years." And so this goes along with what we've seen in today. The Bible says the days of our lives are 70 years, if by reason of strength goes into 80. And that's right there where our average life expectancy of 77 is today. And so that goes right along with what we see from the Psalm. Now we spend $13,400 every year per person in this country on medical care, and we're still stuck within the same life expectancy reflected in a biblical writing from 3,500 years ago. Aging, in other words, seems to have remained constant for thousands of years, despite we spent $4.5 trillion last year on medical care. But what about earlier? If you look in the book of Genesis, you see a lot of people living extremely long lives. Adam lived to be 930. His son Seth lived to be 912. Noah lived to be 950, and the oldest reported, Methuselah, lived to be 969. And these people were said to have fathered children at those very old ages. We see lots of Old Testament figures in the early part fathering children. Noah fathered a child when he was 500 years old. And the interesting thing is that when you read this in Genesis, these people are not presented as being out of the ordinary. It's just reported like everybody lived to be that old. It wasn't that just a few biblical heroes were said to have lived that long. It was normal. And then many years beyond those times, the times of Adam and Seth and Methuselah and Noah, many years beyond those times. When we get up to Abraham, Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac 180, and Jacob lived to be 147. And then many hundreds of years later than that, when we got up to the time of Moses, Moses lived to be 120. But then go up many hundreds of years beyond that, we get to the time of David and Solomon. David died at 70, Solomon at 60, and by that time it was in the 60 to 70 range. So when you look at it, what you have is, in the early part of Genesis, we see people living 700, 800, 900 years old, and then we have Noah and the flood. Noah and his sons lived to be very old again, but if you look in Genesis chapter 11, where the descendants of Noah are listed, you'll see that as the generations go on, they live less and less and less years. And by the time it gets down to a man named Terah, who is the father of Abraham, it's 205 years. Abraham was 175, Moses is 120. So you see there's a gradual decrease there in the age. And that's true. That after the flood, you can look at that. People gradually lived less and less and less numbers of years until when we get to David and Solomon's time, when it quit decreasing, and it's about where it is now back then. So we see people living many, many hundreds of years before the flood. After the flood, we see it start decreasing gradually over the generation until it gets to the range we have today. I think that's fascinating to look at it that way. So what do we do with it? Well, you know what most people are going to do with it today? They're going to say it never happened. They're going to say that the ancient Hebrews just wanted to make these early biblical figures into some larger-than-life figures, and so they just made this thing up about them living so long. But like I said a minute ago, it's not just one or two major figures that lived that long. It's everybody back then in the early parts of Genesis. And what I really find interesting to me is that it just doesn't drop off all of a sudden. It makes a big gradual decline over many, many generations. Also, something that's interesting is that you find that not only among the ancient Hebrew people, but China, India, Rome, Greece, and Japan, among others, all have traditions that say people lived extremely long lives in the very ancient past. And so there seems to be agreement among all the people of the world that there was a time in humanity's past when people lived hundreds and hundreds of years, and they remained vital during those years. It's doubtful if these people would have had any contact with each other. I doubt the ancient Hebrews ever had any contact with the Japanese. So it's not like Moses and his family went to Japan on vacation one year and they found out that the Japanese had these good stories about people living 800 years, so they came back to Jerusalem and said, hey, let's make up some stories about our people living that long too. You know, that's probably not what happened. Those societies probably never were in contact with each other. So the fact that so many independent societies throughout the world tell of times in the ancient past when people in the normal course of things lived to be hundreds and hundreds of years old makes me want to entertain at least the possibility that it is true. So why do people just categorically reject that today? Were they alive back during the time of Noah and saw that he didn't live 500 years? I mean, you get there in the Bible and you say, well, Noah lived to be, his father to child when he was 500 years old. Well, I know that didn't happen. Well, how do you know? Were you there? Did you see it? That's what I want to ask these people. How do you know it didn't happen? Were you there? No, they weren't there. It's because they've never seen anyone to live that long. It's because they can't imagine how somebody could. Most importantly, it's because science tells them it couldn't happen, and science is the God of our society. You see, it is our conviction that we understand it all that makes us sure that these things in the Bible are made up. Not only in relation to this, though, but in relation to everything. There is no more attitude in a human being more dangerous than to think that we understand it all. None. But what if just for a minute we entertain the possibility that these ages as reported in Genesis are true? That the ages reported in China, India, Japan, all these other places are true? What if people in the ancient past actually did live hundreds and hundreds of years in the normal course of things? Something obviously happened to change that, because we don't see that happening today. Over a period of time, human lifespans gradually decreased until they get to the point where we see in the Psalms 70 to 80 years, which is exactly the same thing we have today. If you take infectious disease, childhood mortality, and wars in the ancient world out of the picture, our lifespan is the same as theirs. So what conclusions would we draw? We could say that aging used to be a much slower process than it is today. Many times slower, because people retained their vitality for hundreds and hundreds of years. But then something happened. Aging started speeding up gradually over the generations until it reached to the point it is today, and then it leveled off. In Christianity, that is associated with the flood. For it is the flood in Christianity that marks the dividing line between when that started to happen. So what is aging? Aging is the term given to the changes that occur in a person's body as they get older and that lead to the decline of bodily functioning. If you're over 50, they say, you have experienced signs of aging. Your body doesn't work as well as it used to. You don't have as much energy, strength, or endurance. And as one that I have found out, you don't have as much patience, because we don't put up with things we used to. We just tend to, your body's not as flexible as it used to be. So talked to somebody last night who was telling me an embarrassing thing happened on one of their vacations. And he sat down on a stool with a backpack on, fell over, and he couldn't get up because the backpack was too heavy. And he said, you're getting old, because when you're young and you fall, people laugh at you. But when you're old and you fall, people run over there and help get you up. I guess that's true. So aging causes a decline in practically all of our abilities. Our physical abilities, our memory, and our learning ability, our understanding, our mobility, causes changes in our vision, our hearing. It causes, even they say it causes changes in your taste. And it changes your ability to communicate because of your hearing. You won't hear what somebody's saying, so you don't know how to respond. And this is true even in the absence of disease. Aging also happens no matter how healthy a lifestyle you live. You can eat broccoli and carrot sticks all the time, and you can juice and do whatever you want to do and exercise and all this, that, and the other. You won't slow down aging one bit. Now, although aging is different than disease, diseases will have more debilitating effects on you as you age because your body's not strong anymore and cannot recover and fight things off. All kinds of diseases and chronic conditions are more likely as we age for that reason. Our body can't defend itself from that stuff. It reduces our immunity to flu and cold. And if you do get something like that, you tend to have it longer and your symptoms are worse. It's almost like your body begins to wear out. But actually it doesn't. Did you know that 98% of the molecules in your body are replaced every year? At least every year. 98%. So your body's not 50, 60, 70, or 80 years old. 98% of the atoms and molecules in your body have been there more than a year. They're constantly renewed. Did you know that the cells of the lining of your stomach are renewed every week? The parts of your stomach that come in contact with food are renewed every 5 minutes. Your skin is renewed every month. Your liver is completely remade every 6 weeks. Even the molecules in your DNA are renewed every few months. That's why we have to eat and drink and breathe. We have to constantly supply new atoms and molecules to our body because our body is continually shedding the old and replenishing with new. The elements that make up our bodies are completely being replaced. What remains about us is not the actual stuff, it's the pattern. Do you have a scar like on your finger or something that you got years ago by cutting your finger? Maybe that scar's been there 30 years, but the cells right there have only been there a few weeks. It's the pattern of the scar that stays there, not the cells themselves. Do you think you had to have a knee replacement because the cells and the tissues and structures of your knees got worn out? No, it didn't. The cells of your knees constantly renew themselves, and today your knee is no older than it was when you were 25 years old, as far as the cells in it go. It's the pattern that somehow changed. So what is the pattern and how does it change? We don't know. It's a mystery. Everything now is blamed on genetics, and but frankly, they do not know where the pattern of aging comes from. So the pattern of aging is not like you wear out like the blade of a shovel wears out. You may not hear as well as you did 40 years ago, but it's not that you've had the same cells in your ear for the past 75 years and they're starting to wear out. They have been replaced many times over your lifetime. Scientists have no idea what causes the pattern of aging. It happens to everyone. Do you know that if you get lucky and live to be 85 years old, and even if you're disease-free, never had anything, there's a 50% chance you will need someone to take care of you simply from the effects of aging. If you live to be 85, there's a 50% chance, even in the absence of any kind of disease whatsoever, that you won't be able to go to the bathroom by yourself. And if you have some kind of disease, the chance is even less. If you live just 5 more years and get to be age 90, there's a 96% chance, 96%, that you won't be able to get up and go to the bathroom unless somebody takes you. Now these figures illustrate how the normal process of aging accelerates in your 80s, even if you're healthy, without any kind of chronic disease. So remember that aging is not due to the body wearing out, because the body doesn't wear out. The atoms and molecules that makes up our body are continually renewed. Where does the pattern of aging come from? Is it possible that it doesn't come from the physical world at all, but it comes from the spiritual? Maybe it is not a physical thing at all. Maybe it is determined on a spiritual level. You know, from what we know, from what scientists tell us about how our bodies are constantly renewed, it doesn't seem like aging should happen at all, because we're constantly renovated with new cells and molecules. It's a process that goes beyond the physical. What if it comes from the spiritual? Maybe it is that human beings are intended to live to only a certain age. In the ancient past, maybe that was 800 or 900 years. Then it got changed. Maybe a force on the spiritual level decided that our lifespan should be 70 or 80 years, and that's it. So maybe it is determined by God that a normal lifespan is 70 to 80 years. If you get really lucky, maybe older than that. Some people die younger, but on average. Maybe that's the way it's meant to be. Maybe our lifespan is limited for a reason. Maybe we're intended to have certain lifespans that on average last only up to a certain age. And maybe that comes from the spiritual realm rather than the physical. If you look at the fact that even in the absence of chronic disease, most people will have to have assistance by the mid-80s and virtually everyone by 90. If you get rid of all cancer, all heart disease, all Alzheimer's, all strokes, what are you going to do? You're going to have people 95 or 100 years old who cannot walk, who cannot talk, who cannot eat, who cannot see, who cannot hear, who cannot turn themselves over in bed, who cannot feed themselves, who cannot go to the bathroom, who cannot dress themselves, who cannot take a shower. They will lie in bed for years and years and years in some kind of facility and never feel the breeze on their face or the warmth of sunshine. Is that life? So maybe we were intended to have lifespans that on average last only up through a certain age. For our Old Testament reading this morning, we heard something from the book of Ecclesiastes. And it says how there's a time for everything. There's a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. Ecclesiastes is one of the most controversial books in the entire Old Testament. It's a part of what's called the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. And the wisdom literature in the Old Testament is stuff that is meant for advice for daily living. And the way they say the wisdom literature was written was people looking around in the world and figuring out how life works, and then they're writing that down. Now, it doesn't really make sense to us to say that there's a time for everything, because we don't want some of those things at all. But the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes was just really telling us, you know, hey, I've lived all these years and I've paid attention to what I saw, and I've looked and I've tried to make sense of things, and here's what I think. So he's telling us there's a time for everything. Maybe there is a time to let go. Maybe there is a time to live and a time to go on. Maybe there's a time to be happy and a time to be sad. Maybe there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Maybe there's a time to plant and a time to harvest. A season for everything under the sun. Maybe there's more wisdom in that than we commonly think.